The factory floor is louder than it has ever been. In the summer of 1946, machines roar across America. Steel presses slam. Assembly lines move faster each week. Paychecks are larger. Store windows are full again. By every visible measure, the war is over and the boom has begun. And yet, behind the noise, something invisible is breaking. Prices are frozen. Not by markets, not by scarcity, but by law. For years, Americans have been told this freeze is protection. A shield. A patriotic necessity. Few notice that it is also a delay. A pressure building quietly inside the system. What follows is not a crash in the streets. It is something slower and far more destructive. To understand how America's post-war boom began to crack, you have to go back before the victory parades back to a country preparing for total war. In 1941, the United States faced a problem no modern industrial power had ever solved cleanly: how to mobilize an entire economy for war without letting prices spiral out of control. Demand would explode overnight. Steel, rubber, fuel, housing, food, wages. If left alone, inflation would surge. So the federal government intervened. Prices were capped, rents were frozen, wages were restrained. The logic was simple and widely supported. War was temporary. Controls would prevent profiteering. Stability would be preserved until peace returned. At first, it worked. Factories expanded under guaranteed contracts. Workers earned steady incomes. Consumers accepted shortages because prices stayed familiar. The system appeared orderly, rational, even fair. But controls do something subtle to an economy. They don't remove pressure, they store it. By 1944, the United States was producing more than any nation in history. Yet the price system, the mechanism that normally signals scarcity and abundance, had been muted for years. Businesses could not raise prices, even as costs rose. Landlords could not adjust rents as cities filled with workers. Farmers faced fixed returns while demand climbed. Underneath the surface, distortions multiplied. Companies adapted in quiet ways. They cut quality. They delayed maintenance. They shifted costs into areas regulators struggled to track. Black markets appeared not because Americans were lawless, but because the official system no longer reflected reality. Still, the war masked the danger. As long as tanks rolled and contracts flowed, the system held. Then the war ended. In 1945, millions of soldiers came home. They needed jobs, housing, appliances, cars, families. Demand surged instantly, but prices were still frozen. Factories wanted to retool for civilian production, but they needed higher prices to justify new investments. Builders wanted to construct homes, but rent controls made many projects unprofitable. What should have been a smooth transition became a bottleneck. Consumers had money but couldn't spend it efficiently. Shelves were stocked, yet shortages persisted. Wages began to rise under pressure from unions, but prices were legally trapped. That gap between rising incomes and frozen prices created an illusion of prosperity that could not last. This is why the story matters. America did not stumble after the war because it was weak. It stumbled because it tried to hold success in place. The price freeze, originally designed to prevent inflation, now delayed it. Each month controls remained. Distortions grew larger. When controls were finally lifted, prices did not adjust gently. They snapped. The first cracks appeared in labor. Workers who had accepted wage restraint during wartime now demanded more. They had waited. They had complied. And now the economy was booming, at least on paper. But employers faced a trap. With prices capped, higher wages meant shrinking margins. Companies resisted. Strikes spread. By late 1945 and into 1946, The United States saw the largest wave of labor unrest in its history: steel, autos, coal, railroads. The conflict was not ideological at first. It was structural. An economy designed for war was being asked to function like a peacetime market without the price system that normally balances power between labor and business. The government stood at a crossroads. End controls too quickly, and inflation would surge. Hold them too long, and production would stall. Neither option was safe. The first major turning point came when officials began lifting price controls unevenly. Some sectors were freed, others remained frozen. The result was chaos. Prices jumped where allowed. Bottlenecks tightened where controls remained. Consumers grew angry. Businesses grew cautious. Confidence began to erode. The boom was still visible, but its foundations were no longer stable. What America faced next was not a sudden collapse, but a delayed reckoning. One shaped by choices made in silence, under fluorescent lights. Years earlier, choices that would redefine wages, housing, and consumer power for a generation. And once the freeze truly ended, there would be no way to put the pressure back inside the system. The question was no longer whether inflation would come. It was how much damage had already been done. When price controls began to crack, they did not fail all at once. They failed unevenly, quietly, and with consequences that spread faster than policymakers expected. In early 1946, officials attempted a compromise. Some prices were released, others remained capped. The hope was to ease pressure without unleashing inflation. Instead, the partial thaw distorted the economy even further. Producers whose prices were freed moved quickly. Costs were passed on. Margins recovered. Investment resumed selectively. But businesses still under controls faced a harsher reality. Their expenses rose while their prices could not. The result was hesitation. Production slowed in the very sectors consumers needed most. Housing was the clearest example. Millions of returning veterans needed places to live. Cities swelled, families doubled up, temporary shelters became permanent. But rent controls, left in place to protect tenants, made new construction unattractive. Builders could not justify costs if future rents were legally fixed below market levels. Supply lagged far behind demand. The shortage wasn't visible in prices, it was visible in waiting lists. Meanwhile, wages surged, workers had leverage. The economy was tight. Factories needed labor to convert from military to civilian output. Unions demanded raises to keep pace with rising living costs. Costs that official price indexes understated because so many prices were still frozen. This mismatch created a dangerous spiral. Employers argued they could not afford higher wages without raising prices. Workers argued wages had to rise because prices were already rising unofficially. Both sides were partly right. Neither trusted the system anymore. Strikes spread not because Americans rejected growth, but because they could no longer see how growth was being distributed. Steel production halted. Auto plants went dark. Railroads slowed. Each strike fed the next, amplifying uncertainty across the economy. For consumers, the boom felt increasingly artificial. Paychecks were higher, but goods were scarce. Savings piled up, but spending felt frustrating. Behind the scenes, policymakers felt trapped. Lifting all controls risked an inflation surge that could erase public confidence. Keeping them risked strangling supply and prolonging unrest. The tools that had stabilized the wartime economy were now destabilizing the peace. The pressure intensified in food and energy. Farmers had operated under price ceilings during the war, accepting limits in exchange for guaranteed demand. After the war, they wanted relief. Many reduced output or diverted goods to informal markets where prices reflected true scarcity. Urban consumers felt the effects immediately. Gasoline, meat, and basic staples became flashpoints not because they were unavailable, but because the system governing them no longer matched reality. This is where the hidden decisions mattered most. Officials did not announce a single dramatic shift. Instead, they negotiated sector by sector, industry by industry. Each release of controls was framed as technical, temporary, necessary, but the cumulative effect was explosive. By mid-1946, inflation accelerated sharply where controls were lifted. Consumers felt whiplash. Years of artificial stability were followed by sudden price jumps that felt unjust, even if they were economically inevitable. Public anger turned political. Support for controls eroded rapidly. What had once been seen as protection now felt like deception. Americans had been told stability was being preserved. Instead, they experienced scarcity followed by shock. Confidence in economic management weakened. Businesses delayed long-term investments, unsure which rules would apply next. Workers pushed harder, fearing that real wages would vanish once prices fully adjusted. Consumers rushed purchases before prices rose further, feeding inflationary momentum. The delayed release had created a surge that was harder to control than a gradual adjustment would have been, and yet ending controls outright still felt dangerous. The government finally moved decisively late in 1946, dismantling most remaining price caps. The logic was blunt. The economy needed clarity more than protection. Markets needed to reset, even if the adjustment was painful. Prices responded immediately. Inflation spiked. Not overnight, but fast enough to shock households that had planned their post-war lives around stable costs. Rent increases spread where controls were lifted. Food prices climbed. Consumer goods followed. The boom, once celebrated, now felt unstable. For many Americans, the question shifted from "How prosperous are we?" to "How long will this last?" The deeper problem was now visible. Price controls had delayed adjustment, not eliminated it. By compressing years of market signals into a short release window, they magnified conflict between labor, business, and consumers. Trust, once eroded, proved difficult to restore. The economy was still growing. Production expanded. Jobs returned. But the sense of shared progress that had defined the war effort was gone. In its place was competition, anxiety, and a growing realization that prosperity without balance can turn against itself. The next stage would not be defined by controls or their removal, but by how inflation reshaped power. Who could raise prices? Who could demand wages? And who would absorb the losses when stability finally broke? That reckoning was already underway, and it would leave lasting marks on American labor, housing, and consumer life long after the headlines about price freezes faded from memory. By the time inflation became undeniable, the damage was no longer theoretical, it was personal. For millions of Americans in 1947, the post-war boom no longer felt like opportunity. It felt like erosion. Paychecks rose, but prices rose faster. Savings built during wartime suddenly bought less each month. What had once looked like delayed prosperity now felt like a quiet loss of control. This was the breaking point. The price freeze had not failed all at once. It had failed unevenly, and now its consequences were landing unevenly too. Workers discovered that wage gains negotiated during strikes were being swallowed by inflation. Employers, having finally regained pricing power, pushed increases through quickly to recover years of compressed margins. Landlords adjusted rents where controls ended, often abruptly. The result was a redistribution of pain that no policy announcement could soften. Housing became the clearest casualty. Rent controls had delayed construction during the critical post-war years. When controls were lifted, the shortage remained, but prices surged. Families that had waited patiently during the war now faced rents they could barely afford. Home ownership, once seen as the reward for wartime sacrifice, slipped further out of reach for many urban workers. The boom was still visible in national statistics, but at the household level, stability was gone. Labor relations deteriorated. Unions had fought hard during the transition, believing wage increases would protect living standards. Instead, inflation undercut those gains. Employers responded by resisting future increases, arguing that labor had already been compensated. Trust between workers and management weakened further. Strikes no longer felt like leverage. They felt like desperation. Meanwhile, businesses that had survived the war under tight controls now moved aggressively to rebuild balance sheets. Prices were raised not only to match costs, but to hedge against future uncertainty. Inflation expectations hardened. Once that psychology took hold, it fed itself. Consumers adjusted behavior too. Purchases were rushed. Big-ticket items were bought early. Credit expanded. Demand surged, not because confidence was high, but because people feared waiting would cost them more later. The very behavior controls had once suppressed now accelerated inflation. Policymakers watched this unfold with limited tools. Price controls had been politically exhausted. Reimposing them risked backlash and non-compliance. Fiscal restraint threatened recession. Monetary tightening was still blunt and poorly understood in its post-war form. The system lacked a clean reset. This is where the quiet betrayal emerged, not by individuals, but by structure. The promise of the price freeze had been stability. What it delivered was delay. And delay had concentrated the adjustment into a shorter, harsher window. Those with pricing power recovered quickly. Those without it fell behind. Farmers, landlords, and manufacturers regained leverage faster than wage earners and renters. The imbalance reshaped post-war inequality in subtle but lasting ways. The political consequences followed. Public confidence in economic management weakened. The idea that government could fine-tune prosperity began to fade. Inflation, once seen as a wartime risk, became a peacetime fear. Calls for restraint replaced calls for protection. The boom, now fully unleashed, no longer felt guided. It was powerful but volatile. By late 1947 and into 1948, inflation slowed somewhat. But the damage was done. Expectations had changed. Labor relations were more adversarial. Housing shortages persisted. Consumer behavior was permanently altered. The system had adapted, but not smoothly. What made this collapse quiet was not the absence of harm. It was the absence of a single moment to blame. No crash, no dramatic policy reversal, just a sequence of decisions that stored pressure, then released it too fast. Who benefited? Industries that could raise prices quickly. Asset holders who saw values climb. Firms that survived the transition gained scale and leverage. Who paid the price? Renters. Late buyers. Workers whose wages lagged inflation. Families who discovered too late that stability had been temporary. The post-war miracle still happened. America grew. It dominated global production. Living standards rose over time. But the promise that wartime sacrifice would translate cleanly into peacetime security was broken. And that break reshaped how Americans understood prosperity, no longer as something managed, but as something fragile. The final stage of this story is not about collapse but legacy. About how the memory of the freeze shaped future policy, future fears, and a lasting suspicion of controls that still echoes decades later. The price freeze did not end the boom, but it changed what the boom meant. And once that meaning shifted, there was no returning to the illusion that prosperity could be held in place by decree alone. By the end of the 1940s, America's post-war economy had stabilized, but it had not forgotten. Inflation eased, production normalized, housing slowly caught up. The boom, in statistical terms, survived. But the way Americans understood economic power, government control, and prosperity itself had been permanently altered. The price freeze was gone. Its shadow was not. For policymakers, the lesson was sobering. Controls had worked in war because war simplified choices. Scarcity was accepted, sacrifice was shared, authority was trusted. But peace exposed a different reality. An economy built on millions of independent decisions could not be held still without consequences. Delaying adjustment did not prevent pain, it rearranged it. This realization reshaped American economic strategy for decades. Future leaders became deeply wary of direct price controls. Even during later crises, oil shocks, inflationary spikes, recessions, the memory of the post-war freeze lingered. Intervention would be debated, tweaked. Indirect tools would be favored, but outright freezes became politically radioactive. The fear was not inefficiency, it was distortion. Labor, too, carried scars. The post-war strikes and inflation surge hardened attitudes on both sides. Employers grew cautious about wage commitments. Unions became more defensive, more focused on cost-of-living adjustments rather than long-term security. The cooperative spirit of wartime production faded into adversarial bargaining. The freeze had promised fairness. What it delivered was conflict delayed. Housing policy reflected the same shift. Rent controls persisted in some cities, but with growing controversy. Developers demanded flexibility. Tenants demanded protection. The shortage created during the controlled years never fully disappeared. Suburban expansion became the release valve, reshaping American life, commuting, and inequality in ways few connected directly back to wartime price ceilings. Even consumer behavior changed. Americans who had lived through frozen prices followed by sudden inflation learned to distrust stability. Buying now felt safer than waiting. Credit became a tool not just of growth, but of defense against rising costs. The psychology of consumption tilted toward immediacy. These were quiet transformations, but they were lasting. Globally, the episode carried weight as well. America emerged from the war as the world's economic anchor. Other nations watched how it managed the transition from control to market. The lesson they absorbed was not simple. Intervention could save a system under extreme stress, but unwinding it required precision and timing. Mistakes would not announce themselves loudly. They would surface years later. This understanding influenced post-war institutions, international lending, and the cautious approach to stabilization that followed. And yet, the paradox remained. The price freeze had not failed because it was wrong. It failed because it was temporary. It bought time when time was needed most. It allowed production to scale, resources to mobilize, and victory to be financed without runaway inflation. Without it, the war economy might have fractured sooner. But by delaying adjustment too long, it ensured that the reckoning, when it came, would be compressed and uneven. This is the silent price America paid for control. Not bankruptcy, not collapse, but a subtle erosion of trust in managed prosperity. The boom that followed World War II became legendary. Factories expanded. Middle-class life grew. American power surged, but beneath that success was a lesson learned the hard way. Prosperity cannot be frozen in place. Markets signal reality, whether governments listen or not. When those signals are suppressed, they do not disappear. They wait. And when they are finally released, they move with force. The post-war price freeze did not break America's economy, but it changed how America understood economic risk forever. That understanding, born not in crisis, but in transition, still shapes how power, inflation, and control are debated today. Because the most dangerous failures are not the loud ones. They are the ones that arrive years later, quietly, after everyone thinks the boom has already been won.